Welcome in, everybody. Welcome to another video for the History Valley YouTube channel with your host, Jacob Berman. Today, I am joined once again by a frequent guest of the channel, David Mirsch. And today we're going to be talking about the apocryphal Joseph and Aseneth. And this is considered to be part of the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, or the books left out of the Old Testament. But David Mirsch here thinks differently. He thinks that the Joseph and Aseneth story is actually talking about New Testament events and not necessarily something that's talking about Old Testament events. So David, tell us, what makes you think that?
Well, first of all, I think it's this current Joseph and Aseneth story is a Mishnaic interpretation of the Old Testament story. The Old Testament story is very, very brief about Aseneth. Just a couple of lines. This version that was written much later, and there's some discrepancy about when it was written, anywhere from the 1st century BCE to the 4th century CE. My own feeling is that because it relates to Jesus, I think it was written in the 1st century CE. The main connection that I came across, and it kind of hit me out of the blue when I was reading this, was that Aseneth sweats blood, just the way Jesus does in the Gospels. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. You know, why would there be two characters that are written about in the 1st century that both sweat blood? There's got to be some kind of connection there. So then I started looking at the Aseneth story a lot more carefully and analyzing it more deeply. And there's much more, you know, obviously, than just that. But basically, the characters that are in it relate to the historical characters of the 1st century CE. They relate to Herod, Herod's eldest son, Joseph, who I believe is Joseph Caiaphas, his wife, Mary. And then they have 2 children in the Aseneth story. The version that I use was translated by David Cook and kind of overseen by online by Dr. Mark Goodacre. And it's the longer version. There's actually 2 versions that are out. This is the longer version that I use.
What other parallels are there between the Joseph and Aseneth story with the New Testament?
Well, the first thing you notice, you know, when you're doing the research on it, is that Aseneth, the name Aseneth, is a theophoric, which is a proper name that includes the name of a deity. And the deity included in the name Aseneth is Neith or Neth, which was the Egyptian goddess from antiquity, who was also known as the Virgin Mother Goddess. So to me, that's a parallel to Jesus's mother, that she was a virgin mother, and Neth or Neith is the Virgin Mother Goddess.
Yeah, Aseneth is even called, it says here in the text, in chapter 15, courage, Aseneth, chaste virgin. Behold, I have heard all the words of your confession and your prayer. So there she is right there, being called a virgin.
Yeah, and strangely enough, virginity plays a big part in this story. I mean, it is kind of a fundamental theme that runs through it. And apparently, if a male and a female were both virgins, according to this story, they were kind of considered brother and sister. At least that's the way it's portrayed in the story. Aseneth is the sister of Joseph, because Joseph in this story is a virgin. He is considered her brother. So there's a real strong connection between virginity in the story. The other thing, too, is that if you take the Pharaoh of the story as Herod, and you take his eldest surviving son during the early part of the 1st century, as Archelaus. The two match up pretty carefully in what they're doing. And I think it gives us an idea of what Jesus's parents went through. Now, you know, from previous, videos that we've done together, that I'm a firm believer that Jesus and his father were both temple priests that worked on building the temple together. And this story kind of reflects that positioning of Joseph and Aseneth, that they're both from well-to-do families. Aseneth, her father, is the priest of Heliopolis, and Joseph in this story is, kind of a leader of Egypt. He's very highly ranked and very highly regarded. So a lot of the story actually is caught up with embellishing who these people are, how great they are. Now, if you go ahead.
I was just going to say this is very curious that Aseneth is called a virgin, because when one reads the Old Testament story about Joseph, there's simply no reason to think that this person is getting the idea from reading the book of Genesis. It is curious. I can see why you think that Aseneth is a play on Mary. It's fascinating.
Well, there's other things too. And some of the things, when you're searching for the historical Jesus, and obviously through this story for his family, there are very, very minor things that you look for, minor aberrations or things that aren't quite right. And in this story, when Aseneth, just when she is at that point of stress where she starts to sweat blood, refers to the Joseph of the story, and says that his father rejected him. Well, in the Old Testament, Jacob does not reject Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
He loves him the most of all his children. He's very fond of Joseph. So that is dropped in there, I believe, to connect to the fact that Joseph Caiaphas wasn't Joseph ben Caiaphas or Bar Caiaphas originally. He was, according to Josephus, he was known as Joseph called Caiaphas. In other words, there's no reference to his parentage or his father or carrying on a family name. He's been given a nickname of Caiaphas. And I think that's why that's in the Joseph and Aseneth story, is that she is basically saying this Joseph that's, so great in Egypt was rejected by his father, to show that same disconnect for Joseph Caiaphas and his father.
Yeah, it's that does make a lot of sense to me. Yeah, the other thing is there's in the beginning of the story, there's an exile into Egypt. That's being brought up in the Pharaoh thing, and one could say this looks like it parallels Matthew's gospel, the nativity story of Joseph and Mary fleeing to Egypt to flee from Herod.
Right, exactly. There are those kind of parallels within this. The other thing too is that in this current story, Heliopolis is the same city that in the Old Testament was referred to as On. And both the descriptions of both of those cities are cities of many columns. And many columns is what the temple looked like when it was being built in the first century CE. There were obviously colonnades and many, many columns that built the whole temple structure.
Yeah.
So I think that's, again, a reference, that makes the connection between, you may think we're talking about Egypt, but we're actually talking about Jerusalem and the temple and the people involved here.
Mm-hmm.
And hang on a second. So I think that and some other things that are in here really connect it, to the first century. Oh, the other thing too is that in this story, there's a not highly detailed, but there's a somewhat detailed description of where Aseneth lives. And if you look at that carefully, it also describes the temple and the Antonia fortress, and that she lives in a tower. So I'm a firm believer that Jesus's mother is also Mary Magdalene, because tower in Hebrew is Migdal. And so she is called the Magdalene, the tower dweller. And Aseneth in this story lives in a tower. And then also it describes like placement of windows and what she can see out of those windows, and a road that could be the Pilgrim's Road, and various things. There's a garden that is fed by a fountain. Well, the Gaion fountain is very, very close to the temple. So all of the references to the description of where she lives relate very closely to the Jerusalem temple and the fountain that is there.
More curious, and is in chapter 21, the son of Joseph, or God's son, he's called the Son of God.
The Son of God,
firstborn Son of God.
Right.
And you shall be called a daughter of the Most High and a bride of Joseph from now on forever. Well, that right there hits me pretty hard. I'm like, it seems to be unavoidable. It's talking about the New Testament, Jesus, because who else in Judaism was, or in the first century, was called the Son of God?
Well, except this is a reference to Caiaphas, Joseph
Right.
Caiaphas, who was the longest serving high priest for the temple in the first century. He served longer as high priest than anybody else. So clearly he was very highly regarded, not only by officials, but by the common people as well. And you have to understand that there were two high priests. They often question, they say Annas was the high priest, and then they call Caiaphas the high priest. There were two Sanhedrins. There was the Great Sanhedrin, which was for religious crimes or questions. And that was a lifetime position, much like our Supreme Court would be. And that was Annas. He was the high priest of that. Caiaphas would have been the high priest of just the regular provincial Sanhedrin, and that would have dealt with civil crime, civil matters. So there are two high priests at the same time. Caiaphas, in his position, could be replaced at any time by officials or by the Roman government. Annas, in respect, is a lifetime. He's in a lifetime position.
Yeah, this is I'm convinced. I'm convinced this is definitely about the New Testament Jesus. And how anybody else and how others can't see this is beyond me.
Well, that's what I ran into. I mean, the people that have studied this say that it's a story of conversion of a pagan to Judaism. And I say, no, that's not the case. The situation here is that it's a conversion between the daughter of the high priest and the temple priesthood, going away from that and going to more towards what Jesus was trying to teach, and obviously supported by his father. It's an internal Judaic conversion, going away from the temple priesthood and going into a more fundamental Judaism.
Yeah, just what more evidence does somebody want? Son of God, virgin births in the same text? That's
Yeah.
his father has the same name as Jesus' father. It's just fleeing to Egypt too. Just how much more evidence does one need?
Yeah. And Virgin Mother Queen, and the other things, she sweats blood like Jesus does. I mean, the correlations are pretty clear. And in this story, we have a reference to the slaughter of the innocents, which historians say, well, there is none. Why isn't there one? Well, because the Gospels tended to embellish stories to keep the truth hidden except to certain people. And in this story, what we have is the eldest son of the Pharaoh, who to me is Archelaus, trying to kill off Joseph and their two children so that he can marry Aseneth. And I think that's the genesis of the slaughter of the innocent story.
And what this shows is that that this Joseph in this text is being compared to the Joseph in the Old Testament by the author or authors. It's like, I think maybe in part. Because the other thing is Joseph was betrayed by his brother Judah. He was sold into slavery.
Slavery, right?
Yeah. And in the New Testament, Judas betrays Jesus.
Right.
Then and then scholarship, there's a huge debate rather many scholars assume Judas Iscariot is historical, but there's also a good sum of scholars that actually think that Judas Iscariot is an allegory and not referring to a historical figure. What do you think about that, actually?
I don't necessarily agree. I think there was a Judas. I think because Jesus and his father Caiaphas had planned the resurrection, had planned the crucifixion and the resurrection, that there had to be somebody in Jesus's group who would turn him over to the authorities to make this happen. And it's hard to imagine that there's just a allegorical character put into the Gospels to play that part. You wouldn't need to play that part allegorically. You could just have the officials grab Jesus standing on a street corner or whatever. The fact that Judas Iscariot is there indicates to me that there was such a person and that he was the one responsible for turning Jesus over to the authorities.
Well, I actually agree. Yes, I think Judas Iscariot was a historical figure. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Obviously, like I say, the Gospels tend to embellish things. They tend to hide things. They don't make it easy for just anybody to pick up and read these things and go, oh, yeah, that's Jesus. He lives over on such and such a street. They are trying to send a message through the Gospels that won't be easily understood by the Romans. I think the temple priesthood probably understood what was going on with these Gospels, but they were highly unlikely to go to the Romans with it because they could have been then dragged into a seditious plot. And so they would have stayed away from the Gospels as much as they could have. The Romans, being foreigners, really wouldn't have understood a lot of what was being put into the Gospels.
When do you think this text was written? Before the Gospels or after the Gospels?
Boy, I've been thinking that a lot. And because of the amount of discussion of virginity in this story, I think it was written part and parcel, maybe a little bit before the Gospels, to counterbalance the suggestion that Caiaphas, as a priest, got Mary pregnant before they were married. And this is a story that's designed to kind of quell that rumor and say, hey, these are the people, and they were both virgins, and this is how they dealt with things, and they were very holy, and you're barking up the wrong tree with that story.
You know, that reminds me of Celsus in the century or two later, second century, late second century, is Origen was writing about him in the first century. He was talking about this guy that believes that Jesus's real father was Pantera,
right?
And there was adultery and affair. Mary wasn't really a virgin; she just got violated by somebody else, cheating on Joseph, and it makes me, or she was forced, violated, molested instead, depending on the version of the story. And
Right.
It makes me think Celsus knew this text, Joseph and Aseneth, when he created this fantasy of his, misunderstanding the story, rather deliberately or not.
And coming up with his own explanation of, what the rumor was going around. Now, right. I can't say that the rumor, that Joseph got Mary pregnant, before they were married. I can't say that that's true or not true. I suspect from what I said to you before about the Babylonian Talmud, Hagiga 14b and 15a, being a reference to the fact, even late, even, in the second century, mid-second century, that the Jews knew that Caiaphas had gotten Mary pregnant beforehand. So I suspect that that's probably what happened. It wasn't just a rumor, it probably happened. But again, the Jews were so afraid of any kind of slander, even with the Pantera story. They could deny it and just say, this is just, we're making this up, or, well, we don't really know if this relates to a real, historical person. They could make up anything to justify saying that without facing a charge of slander. And they certainly would do that if the Romans had damned Jesus's memory. They certainly want to connect anything directly to historical Jesus. So they would, metaphorically talk about it. They'd make up stories about it, but they wouldn't come out and directly say, who this was about.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, the parallels are just insurmountable. They just keep going and going and going when you keep reading these texts.
In the shorter version, when Joseph, and here's another reason why it's an internal change in her attitude. There's a segment where she rejects her father and his teachings and his gods in Egypt. So to me, that's rejecting the temple priesthood. But in the shorter version, the angel that comes to see her in her room, tells her to go get some honey, and she says, well, I'll go to, out and go get some. And he said, no, go look in your cupboard. And this magical honey is in her room. So that means to me that she's Jewish to begin with. She's not a Gentile. The honey is there. But then when, Aseneth goes to the cupboard as directed by the angel, she finds the honey that he has directed her to get. And as I said a minute ago, that to me would indicate that this is not a pagan change of heart by her, that because the honey is already there, she's Jewish or Judean, because the honey is in her room, it exists there. Then once the honey is on the table, there's some mystical things that happen with the bees coming out of it and what have you, and touching her lips and surrounding her and what have you. But the angel takes his finger and carves in the shorter version, in the Syriac version of this story, he carves a red cross into the top of the honeycomb. And that to me is pretty significant of a connection to Christianity. But the Syriac version, as I say, is shorter and it came along later. And I think they had already determined at that point to make a connection between this story and early Christianity. I don't think the original longer Greek version had that. And so they were not as intent on making a direct connection to early Christianity with the first version. But that doesn't negate all the parallels that are already there. They exist, in the earliest version that we have. And it's pretty clear from my reading of it, and I think now from your understanding of it, that it's definitely, a metaphor for the people of the time of Jesus in the first century. I just don't see how you can get around that with all the parallels that are there. The other interesting thing, too, is that they never mention the name of the Pharaoh's eldest son. They just keep calling him the eldest son of the Pharaoh. The eldest son of Herod at that time would have been Archelaus, because his three older brothers had been killed off by Herod the Great. So by the time this story was written, Archelaus would have been the eldest son of Herod, and therefore the eldest son of the Pharaoh. So that's kind of how I drew that connection. But, I just don't see how you cannot see the correlation.
What do you think makes scholars think otherwise? What is it that they think that they're seeing in the text that makes them think this is just a pagan conversion story?
This is going to lead into what's going on with the Gospels too. And there is an attitude or a feeling among scholars that what they're reading, which is based primarily on Christian tradition, doesn't allow for a much deeper reading of things. I think when the Aseneth story was first, coming around, scholars were looking at it and what have you, they had already predetermined their view of things. And the idea that this could somehow relate to Jesus and his family just never crossed their minds. They were of the opinion that nothing was written about Jesus other than the Gospels, and nothing whatever was written about his parents. And so I think that just kind of spread throughout. I think there's an interesting quote, and I wish I could attribute it to who said it. Historians don't study history, they study historians. In other words, a lot of times they don't dig deeper into the history of things. They just tend to accept what other historians have said. And I think that's kind of true of the Aseneth story. People have come to the conclusion that it's a pagan conversion story, therefore that's what it is. A good scholar came up with that. So, and, we can trust what he says. So that's what it is. I'm not restricted by that. So I tended to look at it, in a different light. I don't automatically accept what scholars say. I tend to look a little bit differently at things and say, well, if this is this, then what does all that mean? And dig a little bit deeper. So I think that's probably more to do with it. And for some, quite honestly, they're going to protect their findings. They're going to protect what they've said. They're not going to necessarily agree with something that refutes their position or what they've discovered. They're going to stick with it. I've run into that with a couple of scholars where I explained something to them and they totally ignored it and went on with what they were going to say, even though what they were going to say and did say in a book wasn't factual. Even though they knew it, they went ahead and did it anyway. So then you get into the psychology of historians and scholars and writers, and that's a pretty deep subject. So those are some reasons, I think.
I want to go back to what we were discussing earlier the dating of the Joseph and Aseneth story, if you had to choose, what is more likely to be the case for you? Does it date after the Gospel of Matthew, or does it predate the Gospel of Matthew?
Well, I would say it predates.
Mm.
I would say at the time that this was written, Jesus would have been in his public ministry. There would have been the rumor of something suspicious about his birth. And so somebody came along and wrote the Aseneth story to refute that idea.
Hmm.
And it's hard for us to understand that this, 2,000 years separation between events and what we're studying. We're not going to understand everything that the people back then would have known. They wouldn't have had, mass media and, the communication that we have. It would have been all word of mouth, and rumors would have spread, and, you kind of picked your own poison, whatever you wanted to believe. So it would have made sense for whoever was supporting Jesus's ministry to get in front of the rumors of an illegitimate birth. So I think it was probably written not too long before the Gospels were written, but certainly I would think at the beginning of his ministry.
Well, I think we can cut it there. This has been a very interesting discussion, and I'm thinking at some point I'd like to do a part 2 to this and make it a live stream and get questions in.
Okay, that's probably a good idea. I don't, how do you put this? This is just something that I'm interested in. I don't make a living off of this, so it's not like I have a lot invested in it. So if somebody comes along and proves me wrong, that's fine. If somebody comes along and says, it can't possibly be this, great, that's fine.
Right. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.